All right, ready to dive deep into a true classic. Today it's Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther.
Oh, a great choice.
It caused a real stir back in the 18th century, even sparked Werther fever.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, people were dressing like the main character. We're going to use these excerpts from a literary analysis by Martin Swales to understand why this story of, like, unrequited love and intense emotions still has such power centuries later.
Yeah.
It even, like, made people worry about copycat suicides.
Wow, that's intense.
Wild.
It really shows you how art can capture a moment in time and, like, really get under people's skin.
Totally. And to really grasp, I think, its impact, we need to understand the world it came from.
Absolutely.
So 18th century Germany, what was going on?
So picture this. A land that's divided, not a unified nation, but all these smaller territories.
Oh, interesting.
And this political fragmentation really shaped the culture.
Okay, I see.
And there was this growing emphasis on inwardness and feeling, this movement called Empfindsamkeit.
Empfindsamkeit. That sounds a bit different from the Enlightenment, don't you think?
Yeah.
All that emphasis on reason and intellect sweeping through Europe.
You'd think so, but they both actually value the individual's experience. They just kind of came at it from opposite sides.
Right.
So the Enlightenment's all about the power of reason.
Yeah.
And Empfindsamkeit's highlighting feeling, emotional honesty.
Right.
And it's like this tension between those two that we see playing out inside Werther.
So he's torn between head and heart.
Exactly.
What about religion?
Oh, yeah. Huge influence. The rise of pietism.
Okay.
This movement focused on personal faith and looking inward,
Yeah.
also fed into this focus on inwardness. It really blurred the lines between public and private. Personal feelings, experiences, those became like things worth exploring, expressing, and that directly influenced this new literary form, the epistolary novel.
Okay, so what exactly is an epistolary novel?
Novels told through letters. It's like getting a secret peek into someone's private thoughts, feeling.
Right.
Totally unfiltered, raw.
Right.
And Werther is a perfect example of tapping into that desire for intimacy, authenticity.
Which is so funny because our source mentions that Goethe himself went to these gatherings where people read their personal letters out loud for entertainment.
Wow.
It's like, living your life out loud before social media.
Yeah, and it shows how much personal expression was valued.
Yeah.
And Werther takes this even further. Unlike a lot of these novels with multiple points of view, we only hear from Werther.
Okay.
It makes it feel super claustrophobic, like we're stuck in his head, seeing the world through his increasingly intense eyes.
Wow. So was that, like, intentional?
Yeah.
To really pull the reader into Werther's emotional world?
It definitely shapes how we experience the story. We're right there with every single thought, feeling, no matter how, like, small or dramatic.
Right. Yeah.
And Swales points out how Werther's language reflects this. As he gets more emotional, his writing breaks down, gets more erratic, mirroring his inner turmoil.
So the writing itself becomes a window into his mental state.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see why this book caused such a stir. Can you give me an example of this intense language?
Sure. There's this early letter where Werther's describing how overwhelmed he is by nature.
Okay.
He uses these super long sentences, all these exclamations, vivid images.
I see.
It's like he's trying to capture the sheer size of his feelings and that feeling of being totally absorbed in the experience.
Is it just nature he's focused on?
Right.
Because he falls madly in love with Laude, too.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe it's not just about feeling, but finding something to pour all that feeling into.
That's a really good point.
Right.
It's not just the intensity of his feelings,
Right.
but this search for something pure, unmediated, something that goes beyond the ordinary, gives him a sense of meaning.
Yeah.
Whether it's nature or Laude,
Right.
he's yearning for this experience that's completely genuine, true.
And that connects back to Empfindsamkeit.
Exactly.
It's like he's living out those ideals, but in a very dramatic way.
In a society that might not fully embrace them.
Exactly.
And that's the conflict.
Right.
Werther has this ideal vision of society. He wants a simpler patriarchal world, like what he reads about in Homer.
Right.
Remember, he sees everything through art and literature.
Right.
Always looking for reflections of his own desires and anxieties.
So he's not just a man of feeling.
No.
He's also deeply intellectual.
Absolutely.
But doesn't this yearning for a simpler world
Yes.
suggest a disconnect between him and his own time?
Yes.
Especially in a society where, like, social standing, courtly manners were so important.
Absolutely. And this disconnect becomes even more obvious when he tries to look at court.
Oh, right, yes.
He's totally humiliated, rejected by the very society he's trying to fit into.
Mm-hmm.
It isolates him even more.
Yeah.
Shows how he just can't conform to the expectations of his time.
Right.
It's like his very nature clashes with the social order.
Okay, so we have Werther, this passionate, introspective guy,
Right.
struggling to find his place in a world that feels increasingly out of sync with his emotional needs.
Exactly.
And on top of that, he's got this intense, maybe even idealized love for Lotte,
Right.
who's already engaged.
Yes. Talk about a recipe for heartbreak.
Right.
And it raises a big question. Is Werther's love for Lotte really love?
Right.
Considering how little he knows her?
Hmm.
Or is it more about projecting his own desires, fantasies onto her?
Ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, what about the role of art in all of this?
Okay.
We know Werther and Lotte are big readers.
Yes, they are.
So maybe for him, it's not just an escape, but a way of understanding, expressing his feelings. You're onto something there. Literature is crucial for both of them.
Yeah.
Initially, they bond over a shared love for books that mirror their experiences.
Unlike what?
Like The Vicar of Wakefield.
Oh, okay.
It's this point of connection for them.
Yeah.
A way of validating their own emotional lives.
So they find comfort and meaning in shared literary experiences.
Exactly.
But I'm also thinking about that famous scene where Werther reads Ossian to Lotte. It creates this incredibly charged moment of connection between them.
Right.
But didn't you say Ossian was actually a forgery?
Ah, yes. A fascinating detail.
Right.
Everyone thought these poems were ancient Gaelic.
Yeah.
But it turned out to be a literary hoax.
Wow.
Created by this Scottish writer named James Macpherson.
Oh, wow. That's a twist.
Yeah.
So does that make the scene less powerful, knowing it's based on a lie?
It's a great question, and I think it speaks to the complicated relationship between art and truth.
Yeah.
Even if something isn't true in like a factual way,
Right.
it can still evoke strong feelings.
Right.
And connect to universal human experiences.
Yes. Yeah.
Just think about how we respond to stories.
Yeah.
We know they're not real,
Right.
but they can still move us deeply.
It's like, even if Romeo and Juliet never existed,
Exactly.
their story still captures something about love, loss.
Exactly.
I can't help but wonder, how would Werther have reacted if he knew Ossian was fake?
I don't know. Knowing his personality, probably not well.
Right. It probably wouldn't have gone over well.
Right.
But I think this is a good place to pause and reflect on what we've uncovered so far.
Absolutely.
We've talked about the cultural, historical backdrop,
Right.
Werther's intense inner life, his struggle to find his place.
Yes.
And we touched on his complicated love for Lotte and his deep connection to art and literature.
Absolutely.
But there's so much more to explore.
Yes.
Especially about Werther as a character.
Because, let's be honest, he can be pretty self-absorbed.
Yeah.
But I get the sense there's more to him. A deeper tragedy, maybe?
Definitely.
But we'll have to save that discussion for next time.
Yes.
I think we've reached the end of part 1.
Indeed.
As our deep dive.
And there's still so much more to uncover.
Right.
Especially when we look at the editor's role in shaping how we understand Werther's story.
Yes, absolutely.
Very interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah, Werther can definitely seem self-absorbed, even a bit melodramatic at times.
Right. But is that all there is to him?
Well, the interesting thing is he's not totally clueless about his own flaws.
Oh, so there's some self-awareness in there.
Exactly. Swales points out that he has these moments, these flashes of self-awareness, where he actually criticizes his own picturesque feeling.
Interesting.
He even recognizes that, like, his tendency to overthink everything, to analyze every little thing, it actually keeps him from really experiencing life.
You know, I think we all have that friend who can never just enjoy the moment.
Yeah.
Because they're so busy, like, dissecting it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Always overthinking.
Always overthinking,
Yeah, it's such a human struggle.
Yeah, it is.
And Werther, he actually puts it really beautifully in one of his letters.
Oh, what does he say?
He talks about how much he wants to just enjoy the present, but he finds himself constantly dwelling on the past, like trapped in his own thoughts.
It's so relatable.
Isn't it?
It's like he's stuck in this loop of feeling and reflecting and never quite getting to that, like, pure experience.
Exactly. And this is where the fact that we only get Werther's perspective becomes really important. We don't hear from Lotte directly or Albert.
Right, yeah.
We're limited to his point of view, which gets more and more subjective as the novel goes on.
So we're basically seeing the story through a distorted lens.
In a way, yes. We're caught in this echo chamber of his thoughts and feelings, which we know get increasingly troubled.
Right, right. So how do we, as readers, make sense of all of this?
Well, that's where the role of the editor becomes crucial.
Oh, right, the editor.
Remember, the novel's framed as this collection of letters that
Yeah.
have been published by this unnamed editor.
Right.
And he acts as a kind of go-between between Werther's inner world and us, the readers.
I see, yeah.
He presents the evidence, offers some context, but ultimately he invites us to draw our own conclusions.
It's like he's saying, here's the story, you decide what to make of this guy.
Exactly. But he's not totally neutral either. He gives us background information, fills in gaps, reminds us that there's a world outside of Werther's head.
Right, he provides a wider perspective.
Yes, and he doesn't shy away from the less romantic parts of the story.
Oh, like what?
Like, his description of Werther's death is pretty graphic, unsettling.
Yeah, I remember that.
It definitely breaks any romanticized ideas we might have about how it all ends.
Right, it kind of brings you back down to earth.
Exactly, and it also connects to all the controversy around the book when it first came out.
Oh, right, the copycat suicides.
Yeah, people were worried about that, thought it was glorifying unchecked emotions.
Right.
But the editor's presence adds a layer of complexity to that.
How so?
Well, he doesn't offer easy answers or moral judgments. He just presents the evidence and lets the reader grapple with the messy, complicated reality of the situation.
That's a really interesting approach. It forces you to think for yourself.
Exactly.
It doesn't give you a simple interpretation.
Right.
So we have to confront these difficult questions about love, loss, the choices we make.
Precisely.
But let's be real, Werther's not the easiest character to, like, it can be so frustrating.
Oh, absolutely. But even with all his flaws, there's something relatable about his struggle, this search for meaning, for authenticity, in a world that often feels stifling, unfulfilling.
Right, that feeling of not quite fitting in.
Exactly. And Swales makes a point about this, how Werther's letters actually have these moments of, he calls it truthful discourse.
Truthful discourse.
Yeah, these passages where his insights kind of go beyond his personal drama and speak to these larger truths about being human.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. There's one where he's describing feeling totally overwhelmed by the demands of society.
Okay.
He talks about his senses becoming dried out from all the distractions, feeling like a puppet controlled by external forces.
It's such a powerful image, and I think so relevant today.
Right.
It's like that feeling of being bombarded with information, stimuli, and losing touch with your own inner life.
Exactly. And that feeling of alienation, disconnection, that's something that resonates with a lot of people today, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Even though the world has changed so much,
right,
that underlying anxiety about authenticity, about finding your place in a complex world, it's still so relevant.
Absolutely. So even though Werther's a flawed character living in a very specific time and place, his story speaks to something timeless, something universal about what it means to be human.
That's a great point.
And that's the beauty of great literature, right? It transcends its context and connects with us on a really personal level.
It makes you think and feel.
Exactly. It makes you confront those big, messy questions about life, love, the search for meaning that we all deal with no matter where or when we live.
That's beautifully put.
Yeah.
But I think it's time we shift gears a bit.
Okay.
And talk about what happened after Werther's story ended.
Right.
We know the book was a huge success, but it also caused quite a stir, didn't it? Didn't people start dressing like Werther?
Oh, yes. It sparked this whole phenomenon called Werther fever. People were totally captivated by his passion, his tragic end.
Wow.
They copied his clothes, his hairstyle, even his melancholic mood. And sadly, as we mentioned before, there were even cases of copycat suicides.
That's really intense. It shows how deeply this book affected people.
Yeah, both the good and the bad.
So I'm curious, what did Goethe think about all of this?
Well, his feelings about Werther were actually pretty complicated.
In what way?
He even joked once that the author should have shot himself.
Oh, well, really?
But later on, he did acknowledge the book's universality, suggested that everyone could relate to Werther's struggles in some way.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
He realized it touched on something really profound about the human experience, something that went beyond the specifics of Werther's story.
Exactly.
And that's why I think The Sorrows of Young Werther continues to fascinate people even centuries later.
Yeah.
It's a story that stays with you, that makes
Yep.
you keep asking these big questions.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a good point to bring in our listeners.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about Goethe's idea that this book was written for each individual reader. So as we come to the end of our own exploration of Werther, I want to ask you, the listener, what does this novel say to you about the challenges of being authentic, of finding your place in the world?
That's a great question to think about because ultimately the power of Werther isn't about giving us easy answers.
Right.
It's about making us confront these big, messy questions about life, about love, about being human.
Absolutely, and I think that's a perfect note to end on. What an incredible discussion.
It really has been fascinating.
Thank you so much for guiding us through this exploration of The Sorrows of Young Werther. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of this book.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
And I hope our listeners will be inspired to pick up The Sorrows of Young Werther and explore it for themselves. They might just find a piece of themselves reflected in Werther's story.
I think they will. And until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds engaged. Happy reading, everyone.
Yeah, it really has. This deep dive has given me such a fresh perspective on The Sorrows of Young Werther. It's like more than just a tragic love story.
Definitely.
It's a reflection of the time, like we talked about,
Right.
but also a study of human nature,
Absolutely.
And it's this timeless exploration of these big questions that
Yeah.
we're still dealing with today.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from, really leaning into those complexities and contradictions,
Yeah.
resisting that urge to oversimplify.
Or to judge too quickly.
And I think Werther himself,
Yeah.
as flawed as he can be, kind of embodies that struggle.
Absolutely. He's trying to navigate this world
Right.
that just doesn't quite make sense to him,
Yeah.
trying to find his own truth and express it authentically.
Right. Even if it means going against the grain.
Exactly.
And I think that's what resonates with people, even centuries later, that yearning to be authentic.
Yes.
That struggle to make your inner world fit with what society expects of you.
Right.
That search for meaning when everything feels so chaotic.
It's such a universal experience.
Yeah, it really is. And that's something I'm definitely taking away from this deep dive.
Me too.
This renewed appreciation for the power of literature.
Yes.
To make us think and feel and question things.
And to remind us that we're not alone in those struggles,
Right.
The human heart, with all its messiness, has been wrestling with these same questions for centuries.
So well said. Thank you so much for guiding us through this incredible exploration of The Sorrows of Young Werther.
It's been my pleasure.
I have a feeling I'll be going back to this book.
Yeah.
With a whole new understanding.
I hope so. I hope our listeners will be inspired to check it out too,
Yeah.
Explore it for themselves. They might be surprised by what they find.
I think they will.
Yeah.
And to all our listeners, until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those minds engaged. Happy reading, everyone.